Good morning, everyone. We're going to wait just a few moments while everyone joins us before we get started.
Alexander and I were talking about how this is the most awkward moment when we're all sitting here waiting for you all to join. Oh, that gives me an opportunity to shut that noise down. Yes.
You'll always have one thing you don't shut off that will
Yeah.
suddenly ring.
Yeah.
Just a few more moments while everyone signs on. Um, in the meantime, I'm going to make sure we'll be putting the link to purchase the book in the chat. And I make sure for you to check that out. All right, let's go ahead and get started. I know some people are still joining us, but we have a lot to cover today, and I know we have a lot of people who are very excited for this program. And I want to thank you so much, Tracy, for joining us this morning. Good morning for us.
Pleasure. It's a pleasure. Hello from over in England. That's where I am right now.
Good morning, everyone else, and welcome to the Hudson Library and Historical Society's virtual author series. Today, we are so pleased to welcome the virtual return of New York Times bestselling author Tracy Chevalier to discuss her latest novel, The Glassmaker, which is fantastic. Before we get started, I just want to remind everyone to please check out all of our exciting upcoming programs. You can find out everything we have going on at hudsonlibrary.org. We have a great lineup of virtual and in-person events, which I'm sure you'll find something that you'll enjoy. At any time during this event, you can ask questions. Please leave them in the Q&A section on Zoom, and we'll try to get to as many as possible this morning. I will also be putting the link to purchase copies of The Glassmaker from our local independent bookstore, The Learned Owl, in the chat. So if you'd like to purchase a copy, please make sure to check them out. And now, without further ado, let me introduce our author. Formally, introduce our author. Tracy Chevalier is a New York Times bestselling author of 11 previous novels.
10, and this is the 11th.
10.
Yeah.
Including Girl with a Pearl Earring, which was translated into 45 different languages, made into an Oscar-nominated film, a play, and an opera. Did not know about the opera. Tracy has visited Hudson, I think, 2 times before. And her latest novel, The Glassmaker, was released in the US in June, and it follows a family of glassmakers from the height of Renaissance era Italy to present day. Kirkus gave it a starred review. Honestly, there was a million fantastic reviews of this book. But I liked this one, that history flows like molten glass in the stunning novel that borders on fantasy, which was beautiful. But welcome, Tracy, and thank you so much for joining us today.
It's a pleasure. I'm just sorry I'm not there in person because I've always had a great time whenever I've come to Hudson, but it's nice to connect with you in this way.
Well, we're just so happy to have you and to discuss your latest book, which there's been several of us here at the library who've read and been big fans of it. I have a couple questions for you. What inspired you? I would love to talk about what inspired you to write this book. I know from reading past interviews and stuff, all of your books have some type of inspiration story, or I'd wonder to
Yeah.
know what went into this.
Yes, there is almost always a, a an origin story, so to speak, and a lot of times it happens to me very suddenly. But this time, I think this will be an inspiration to all of you readers out there because I have often had readers come up to me and suggest topics they think I should write about, or people, or places, artworks. And I usually, I don't dismiss the idea, but I usually just hear it and think, yes, but it's not really my thing. It's your thing. And actually, often I say, maybe you should write this book, because they're very passionate about it. But in this one instance, I actually listened to a reader and it stuck with me. And it was years ago. I was doing an event in Italy, and a man came up to me afterwards and said, I think that you should write about Venetian glass beads because they were made for trade and for jewelry and stuff over the centuries, mainly by women sitting at their kitchen tables over a little lamp. And here's some books about them. And I took the books. I thanked him. I looked at the books that night in my hotel room and I thought, I don't know about this. But when I got home, I put them on the shelf. I didn't give them away to a thrift shop. I kept them. And years later, when I was trying to work out what I wanted to write next, I started thinking about those beads. And I often in my books write about people making things, and particularly women. And so I think this idea of women making beads at their kitchen table kind of stuck in the back of my mind. And then the notion of actually writing something set in Venice was just too good to pass up, because Venice is so gorgeous. And I've been quite often, but to have a reason to go back to do research and get to know the place better was too good to pass up. So that's what gave me the initial idea to write about it.
I was gonna say, I noticed from reading so many of your previous works, you do feature a lot of makers, and I wonder what,
What brought me into why do I do that?
yeah, or like,
Yeah.
you'd also spoke, there was an interview with you recently about like the writing flow, and is that something you can relate to in your characters?
Yeah, I think I write about people doing things with their hands because that's what our ancestors did. When you think about it, our ancestors mainly made everything. They made their food, they grew and made their food, cooked. They made their own clothes, they made their own furniture. Everything that we buy, they made. And so when I was, and most of my books are set in the past, so before and are pre-industrial, so people couldn't just go to department stores or go online and buy things. So I when I've been writing books set in the past, I often think about what people are doing during their daily lives so that we can connect to them, so that we can understand what the world is like around them, how they live, how they go through the day. And it occurred to me that a lot of times they would be spent making things. And so this sort of crept into my books quite early on in small ways. Buttons, chairs. Then it started to get a little bit bigger with The Last Runaway, which is set in Ohio, and quilts play a large part in that. And it started to get larger and larger. And my last novel was called A Single Thread, and it was about embroidered cushions and kneelers in Cathedral in England. And this just sort of fit right in. So I think I also am really fascinated by what goes on when you're creating something. So whether you're writing a novel or knitting a jumper or making a glass bead or carving a chair, you have to the best thing you really need, and everybody who's out there probably does something like that. A lot of people do things where you get into what I call the flow, or what is called the flow, and you focus, everything falls away. You stop looking at your computer or your phone. You stop answering the phone. Everything kind of goes, and you're just not focused on that one thing and making it the best you can. And that it's not always easy to get into that flow, but I think that our ancestors certainly had it, and they probably had fewer distractions. And we can have it. We just have to set aside all that stuff. So I think maybe by writing about people making things and getting into the flow, I'm also exploring what I'm doing as well. Um, Alex, you have muted yourself.
Thank you. I was just figuring we'd touch on it because there is a passage when our main character, Orsola, who the book follows her family, and we'll touch a bit on how it follows it through the Orso family. But she was approached by another character as she was making her beads, and they had asked if she enjoyed it, and she just basically, to summarize it, immensely. And she just felt like she was very in a world of her family chaos, taking care of kids, laundry,
Laundry, cooking, yeah,
endless amount of tasks. Like she finds like a moment of zen just doing something what sounds incredibly difficult.
yes. Yes, it is quite tricky. And yeah, so the book is actually set mainly on Murano, which is the glass island off of Venice. Glass has been made in Venice for 1,000 years, but they moved all of the furnaces and the workshops to this little island that's like a 15-minute boat ride from Venice because it was trying to they were trying to contain what fires might break out. They didn't want to burn down a whole beautiful city. They thought just burn down a little island, that'll be okay. And but they also wanted to control the glassmakers because Murano glassmakers were incredibly skilled, and the Venetian merchants made a lot of money from them, from the trade of glass, and they don't want those glassmakers with all their skills and secrets to go to the mainland, to go to continental Europe and start workshops there because it would create competition. So they made the glassmakers all go live on this island, and they said, if you leave, we will come after you and kill you. So that threat was enough to keep them there. And in fact, dozens of families are still there. There used to be hundreds of families making glass, and now there are a few dozen. But if you ever go to Venice, or if you've been to Venice, you'll know that you can easily go over to Murano and watch them making glass and buy all kinds of glass stuff. It's an amazing place. So this book follows one family I've made up called the Rossos, and they make glass over hundreds of years, and it follows mainly the heroine, Orsola Rosso, who is a girl when the book starts and a woman in her late 60s when the book ends. And she, because of a family tragedy, she wants to help her family out financially. And she can't join the men in the workshop, but she can learn to make beads. And that's what she does over this little lamp, an oil lamp, at the kitchen table at night.
We, I, I think this fits well, and usually we save Q&A to end, but I was about to ask the same question. I just noticed we had someone who wrote in, Rachel said,
Right.
one of the things that I think the book, and you were able to immerse yourself in this family and their sweeping history so easily, is because the details just are so vivid in your books. And you had mentioned that you take up the craft you're writing about, whether it's fossil collecting, quilting. Did you take up glassmaking or look into it?
I looked into it. I didn't, when I researched quilting for The Last Runaway, I started quilting myself and I still do. But glassmaking is like requires a whole bigger set of equipment than a needle and thread. And I can see why people are interested in it, but I also I realized how fearful I am of extreme heat. So I did a few sessions, both on Murano and also in London where I live, and with a couple of bead makers who taught me how to, you use this little skewer and you melt glass around the end of it, and then you move it back and forth to get it symmetrical in the right shape, and use these little paddles to do what you would, and then you decorate it with other different colors. And it was hard, and but I like to do what my characters do because it's so much easier than to write about it, and also gives me ideas of details to include that will give some verisimilitude to the writing so that the reader know what I'm know that I know what I'm talking about. So I had a lot of fun doing that, and I also did a session in London with with glass blowing. So I made a paperweight and a vase, sorry, and a bowl. And but mainly my teacher made them because I was I was busy kind of, it was so hot. I had all these protective stuff all over me, and the glass, when it gets close to you, it's just so hot. And then when you have to take it over to the furnace, wow, they make it seem so easy. The guys and women who work there, just pulling the glass in and out of the furnace, they stand really close to it for a long time, don't seem to notice it at all. I stood next to it and had to go, whoa, I can't believe I'm not burned. It's scary, and you're trying to shape this thing. And blowing it is actually harder than it looks. So they make it look easy. And I realized how hard it was, and that helped me to write about it. So I do like to do what my characters do if I can, because not only is it fun and scary, but it also gives you, the reader, a feeling of that what's on the page is actually what really happens.
It feels grounded in a sense.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
and I think it's good that it's grounded because some parts of the book aren't really grounded. But this might be a good point for me to do it. I was going to do a really short reading.
Sounds great.
Then we get into the more fantasy ungrounded bit of it. But this leads well in. So Ursula has had this family tragedy, and she went to this woman who really existed called Maria Barovier. Maria Barovier was one of the very, very few women in glassmaking, and in the 1480s, she invented a bead that was not made over a lamp, but made at the furnace, and she became very famous for it. And Ursula goes to her and says, "What can I do to help the family?" And she says, "Make beads. Make beads. They don't cost as much, and you can do it at night at the kitchen table. But they'll bring in a little bit of like what we used to call pin money when I was a kid, like all the stuff you make that brings in a little bit of money." So Ursula gets these lessons from Maria Borovier's cousin, and she's been working on it. And then her mother has a baby, so she has a little sister. And this is a scene where she's got her little baby sister with her, and she runs into Maria Borovier. One afternoon, Ursula was bringing Stella back from the wet nurse and took the long way around so that she could walk along Murano's Grand Canal. It was quiet compared to the Venetian Grand Canal she'd had a brief taste of, but there were a few palazzos to admire and wealthy Venetians holidaying in them to spy on. The baby was in a post-feed daze, and Ursula was in no hurry to get back to the stinking laundry and grubby house. She paused by the water, ever moving, glistening in the autumn sun, and took out a bead she'd made and now carried in her pocket. It was a translucent green, like the canal, where you couldn't see the bottom. She held up the bead to admire its color to the water. "Admiring your own work, are you, Orsola Rosso?" Maria Brovia had come to stand beside her. Ursula dropped her hand, embarrassed. I haven't had the chance to make much." The bead maker nodded at Stella, asleep on her sister's shoulder. "They take up all your time, don't they? Show me." She held out her hand. Ursula reluctantly dropped the green bead into her palm and held her breath as the older woman inspected it. "Not yet," she said, handing it back. "The shape and color are good together, but the symmetry is not quite there." Ursula sighed. "Glass is so hard to control." "That's what I like about it. It's an unpredictable mistress. It has its own laws. You have to practice more before you show your beads to Signor Klingenberg. The merchant needs to have no reason to turn you down. There are no women in the glass business, because our work must be perfect to be accepted by men, and with glass, there is no such thing as perfection." "You are in the business, though." Maria Barovier shrugged. "I'm an anomaly, the exception to the rule. I suspect it will take a very long time for women to be accepted into the glass world. Hundreds of years." She gazed at her protege. "Are you sure you want to spend your whole life knocking on that door to the workshop?" "Maybe." "Imagine yourself in the future, then, trying to make a living, making beads for gentlemen, for countesses, and even empresses. Imagine they reject you because of a whim, changing tastes, wars and plagues and poverty, things outside of your control. Can you imagine all that and still do lamp work?" Ursula looked out across the shifting, glittering water, contemplating the shifting, glittering, unpredictable path ahead of her. "Yes," she replied at last, "I can." Because already she was as attached to her bead lamp as if it were a child. Maria nodded. "Take this, then. A gift to keep you going." She reached into her pocket, pulled out a bright new Rosetta bead, and handed it to Ursula, then turned away without even a goodbye. Ursula studied the bead, beveled so its layers of red, white, and blue glass shone through in a scalloped pattern, and smiled. "Grazie, Signora Maria," she called after the bead maker. Maria Barovier waved a hand in the air without looking back.
I think one, that passage just perfectly sums up the time aspect of the book as well.
Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, you're probably wondering, you're hearing this, and thinking, wait a minute. Ursula, you said Ursula is 9 years old when the book starts, and she's in her late 60s when it finishes, and yet the book spans 500 years of Venetian history. So, how does that work? It starts in 1486, it ends in 2022. How do you do that? And how do you do what Maria Brovier says? You're going to be making beads for gentlemen and empresses, and you're going to go through war and plague and poverty. Those are all things that happen in the book. So she kind of neatly sums up what's going to happen. Um, I decided early on I wanted to cover the span of 500 years of Venetian history because I think most of us don't really know much about Venice. We go there and we see this incredibly beautiful city with these very old buildings, no cars, and we just and then we but and yet it's full of tourists, and it used to be incredibly wealthy as a trade center, and now it's a tourist destination and not much more than that. So how did it go through this decline? And I thought I need to cover all of that sweep and how that decline affects the glassmaking industry and this particular family. But I also thought early on, I hate it when I'm a reader and a book covers a lot of period of time and you following these characters and you really invest in them, and then suddenly you have to care about their descendants, like their great 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 grandchildren. It's like, who wants to do that? So I was debating, how do I fix this? How do I use, and I just thought, well, you know what, I'm just not going to have them die. I'm going to have a different section. Each section is a different century, and it covers a different particular thing that happens in Venice. And I'll just have the family and everybody around them, everybody in Venice ages at a different rate from the rest of the world. So you skip from one section to another, 100 years goes by, but the characters are only a couple of years older. And I know it sounds disorienting, but it actually, because the book itself is so grounded, as Rachel has said in her comment, is so grounded in daily life, in the detail of daily life, of making glass, of running a household, of living on Murano, of living in Venice, that it's very much a Tracy novel when you read that. It's just that it has this time skipping over. And honestly, I promise you, you'll forget. You're reminded every section that things have happened in the world, but people just age a little bit. And I think I did this partly because I wanted to cover all this time, but also I researched and wrote a lot of it during the pandemic. And I don't know about you, but time for me just went kind of weird and elastic. And I almost feel like we lost a couple of years there. So we skipped over time. We've gone from 2019 to 2022, like, and maybe that made me feel like I could do it myself in a book. And the other thing is that Venice is such a timeless city. When you're there, you really feel like the rest of the world falls away because it's so old and it doesn't have any connection with the rest of the world, and or it doesn't seem to. And so maybe I think if anywhere can skip over time, it's in Venice.
I would second your thought that like the time jumping aspect of it just felt so seamless to me. At the beginning of each chapter, you give the year, what age everyone is in the family, and some like historical context. And because the family unit just stays together for the most part, they just are so focused on their work and trying to succeed in this business, which
Yeah.
has its ups and downs. I kind of would forget where we were in time until the end. No spoiling, but she was texting because it was in modern day. And I was like, well, when did you get a cell phone, huh?
Yeah.
Like, I was like, when I had to
Yeah.
like double take, because it just kind of moves you. I like the aspect of like you get so emotionally invested in a character and I can follow her through time and the family dynamics stay the same
Yeah.
as it goes,
Yeah,
which was
very
fun.
close-knit family. True.
Yeah.
And also quite a big family, which is, I had to juggle a lot of kids, and everybody had a lot of kids. So there's there's quite a lot of, yeah. Yeah, but it's the other thing is that the people know on Venice and on Murano, they know about this time thing, but they don't care. They're like but I had to work really hard to make that work and to make it as seamless as you've said it is. And in fact my editors, I have a US and a UK editor, and they read it and they sort of went, and it's for early draft, and they said, Tracy, shouldn't they all be dead? And you haven't really helped us here. So when I redrafted, it was adding that framework in and basically sort of saying to the reader quite directly, here's what I'm doing. Just relax into it. Don't worry about it. It's going to be fine. And but it took a lot of, you know, like the image of the swan, like la la la, and underneath you're paddling really crazy. That's sort of what the editing was like.
It was just seamless how they moved through, and I would find myself forgetting that we had progressed, even though there was new events. It just kind of felt natural, which,
Yeah.
like you said, you start in 1486 and end in 2022. Like,
One
love
thing I
time it's
noticed
gone.
when I was jumping, moving, is that our world is getting faster and faster, and change is faster and faster. You know, the change in how people lived from, say, 1486 to 1755, not that much, or even the 19th century. It really was not, people were still doing their laundry by hand, and and then when electricity comes in, and instead of boats that you paddle, that you row all the time, you suddenly have steam-driven gondola, vaporetto, and then eventually gas, when you get gas. And it changes for the glass makers too. It used to be the furnaces were all kept going with wood. That was the fuel. And now it's all gas. And for lamp work, for the bead makers, they used this little lamp that they melted animal fat in. It's very smelly. And they had a little wick that came out and the flame would come up and they would use that. But now bead makers, and when I learned to do it, bead makers use a little can of gas and a little jet flame that's really steady and really hot. It's hotter than this little other lamp would have been. And so the technology has shifted, but actually what they make has not changed that much. I mean, that's what's so amazing about the glasswork you see from the 16th century is these incredibly elaborate chandeliers. And you go, how did they do that? And they still make them like that. You know, what they produce is not so very different. I mean, there's a lot more maybe modern art about it, but it's still, the techniques are not that different.
I, I'm curious because you're covering 500 years of history throughout this book of Venetian history, but one family history. How do you go about choosing what events and times to highlight in the book? And also, you include several real historical figures. How do
Yeah.
you pick and choose who to?
It was hard. I mean, for one thing, thousands of books have been written about Venice and set in Venice. So it was trying to weed through all that and figure out what I should read, because otherwise I would never have written the book. So I consulted with a few people and said, what are the best and shortest history books I can read about Venice? So I read them, and so I got the grand sweep of the history, and I sort of decided early on I wanted to, I had to have some sort of structure. So I said, okay, it's going to more or less be every century. So I hit 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th, 20th, 21st century. And then within that, what were the events or the people who had the most effect on Venice, although not necessarily obviously. So one of them is Napoleon. Napoleon invaded and conquered Venice in 1797, got rid of all the nobility, and then handed it over to the Austrians, who kind of wrecked the city because the Austrians didn't like water. So they would cover over all the canals, some of the canals, so that they could ride their horses through. And I've been to Venice a lot, and I hadn't realized that till I read it. And I thought, I think I want to write about that. And the other thing the Austrians did is, it's about 2 miles to the mainland, from Venice to the mainland. They built a bridge. And I thought, how does that psychologically change for the glassmakers and the Venetians the thought that they're now connected to the mainland. And then in the 20th century, or later in the 19th century, trains started coming there and more tourists. And so how does that affect them? And then earlier on in the 16th century, there was a really terrible plague in 1575, and it killed a quarter of the population. And I knew I wanted to cover the plague, and I also knew I wanted to cover COVID-19. So and it was kind of odd because I was researching the plague of 1575 just after the first lockdown, and the British Library in London, where I do a lot of research, had reopened, but you had to wear a mask and sit 2 meters apart from other people, and it was limited how many people could come in. And I just thought this is so surreal, sitting here taking notes about the plague of 1575 when there is a plague around us. And also discovering that they did a lot of the stuff, or we did a lot of the stuff that they had done. So quarantining, tracing when somebody got the plague, when they got that or they got COVID, you had to write down, you had to tell people who you had seen, and you had to let them know, and they did that too. And it was a very odd experience, and in a weird sort of way comforting, and also partly because I realized that we were comparatively very lucky. At least we have some modern medicine. And so I don't know what the percentage of the population who have died of COVID, but it's certainly not a quarter of the population. I mean, a quarter of a city, can you imagine? Wiped out. So I knew that that would have a big effect on the city and on the glassmakers. And so it's choosing that, and also choosing people who represent different aspects of Venetian life. So Maria Barovier, the bead maker, very important. She's a real person, is in it. Casanova makes appearance because he kind of represents the playboy and the kind of the carnival and the sort of dissipation of Venice into becoming this kind of gambling, prostitution, lascivious lifestyle. And I thought he's perfect for that. And and Josephine, Napoleon's wife, makes a visit to Venice. She really did too. And so I thought I would use that. So it's just like cherry picking what felt like the most important to me anyway for the story, though not necessarily the most obvious.
I, I enjoyed, yeah, I was gonna say that there was key out historical timeline feature like the plague stuff I knew that was like, well, you're gonna have to cover. But the Napoleon covering it through, he had already conquered Venice. You're going through like Josephine, her visit. Like that's a side of it I hadn't
Yeah.
seen, and it was interesting.
Yeah, I didn't really want to have it be about the battle to take Venice. I wanted it to be about Napoleon actually didn't visit Venice. He sent his wife to have a little look to see what she thought and what they should do with it. And so the glassmakers, the merchants of Venice, everybody wined and dined her, took her to operas, all kinds of stuff. And I make up this that Orsola makes her a necklace to see if this will seduce her and make her think, oh, we got to save the glass, let them remain an independent republic rather than be taken over by the French or the Austrians. And you'll see how that works out. But yeah, it was not always the obvious battle or man. It's sometimes it's the people on the sidelines that I focused on.
I'm trying to see, we got a few more questions before we turn over to the Q&A because I know we have questions coming in. I was wondering if you could talk a bit, because I know we always get asked, so I'd like to include it, a bit about your more about your life as a writer. What can you talk a bit about your career, how you got started, and what a typical day looks like for you?
Oh, okay. Um, so I grew up in Washington, D.C., and I went to Oberlin College, so not far from you. And I majored in English. I always loved books. I read a lot as a kid, and I think that made me, I was pretty sure that I wanted to do something around books. I either wanted to, when I was a kid, I said I wanted to be a librarian. Gwen Meyer will be very happy to hear that, and any librarians out there, or I wanted to be a writer. And then I discovered as I got older, in college, I discovered publishing because, you know, when you're a kid, you don't know that there's a company out there that makes the books. So then I thought I wanted to go into publishing, and I did after I graduated. And I ended up moving to England and to London, and I worked in publishing there for a long time, well, for several years. But at the same time, I was writing short stories on the side. And eventually I stopped the editing and I did an MA in creative writing and I wrote my first novel. And then I freelanced for a while but then when Girl with the Pearl Earring came out, I was able to write full time because it did so well. So that's kind of me in a nutshell. And I've been in England for almost 40 years. I know, and I still sound like this. I have never taken on the accent. So yeah, so that's me. And then my typical writing day, I mean, my work as a writer is really varied. So depending upon where I am in the process of a book, I might be doing research, so I might be reading and taking notes or going to talk to somebody or looking at paintings, looking at images. But when I'm writing, my typical writing day, I write by hand, which is unusual in this day and age. I realize in hand in a notebook, and then at the end of the day, I type it into the computer. And I try to start relatively early, or not relatively, I mean about 9 o'clock, and I write better when I'm well, actually, I write all the time. You know, I write and then I stop and then I do something else and I come back to it. But I try to write 1,000 words a day, which is about 3 pages. It's not that much, but to get it right, you know, it's quite a struggle. So, and every day is like facing the blank page, which is kind of exhausting. And so you have to kind of work your way into it. And one trick I have is that I'll be writing a scene, and if I get to, you know, I don't count every word, but if I sort of know I've reached the end, the amount I wanted to do that day, sometimes I have a little bit more left in the scene to do, and I know what I want to write, but I leave it for the next morning because then I can use that to jumpstart me. So, because sometimes it's a bit daunting to sit down and go, okay, what do I do now? And for me, the really hardest part is starting a new chapter or a new section because you've kind of closed it off and now you have to open it up again. And sometimes it's not always obvious. And I don't plan ahead everything. I think the way I look at it is I usually know, I research like for several months before I do anything, before start writing the book. And so I'm making up characters in my head, but it's only when I start writing the character that I get to know them. And that can be kind of daunting, not really knowing exactly. So often I'll start writing, and by the end of the book, I know them much better, and I go back to the beginning and rewrite. And then there's a lot of rewriting that goes on. So that's kind of my life, my writing life in a nutshell.
I imagine it's also daunting starting a new chapter when you're fast forwarding history to so far
Yes,
in
it
this
was. This
one.
was a particularly hard book, and you know, there's been a 5-year gap between this book and the last book, and that was partly because of the pandemic. I mean, everybody slowed down. I became much less productive, and I realized during that time that I need variety to stimulate me. I need to go different places and see people and travel and go to art galleries, and you know, I just need busyness. And when it's really quiet, it actually doesn't make me write more or quicker. So it was partly that, and partly it was juggling 500 years of history and this time element. So when I finished it, and the editors sort of went, you need to help out the reader here a little bit. I had to redraft for several months to smooth things out. And that it was worth it. It's, you know, I think it's a better book for it. And actually I had to change the ending because I had it. And what the editors said was, the thing is, Tracy, if you're going to do this illogical thing about time, because it is illogical, no time skips like that. Um, you have to be consistent or logical within the illogical world. And I hadn't been entirely consistent. And they pointed out various things, which I fixed. And the ending, I kind of knew I had written it, and I thought, Yeah, I always knew I was going to have to change it. I just didn't want to admit it until somebody said it. So then they said it and I had to change that. So it all took a lot of time. That's why there's this big gap. But I hope readers forgive me, and I think they will, partly because, as I said earlier, I feel like we've all lost 2 years. So actually, it's only 3 years between the books. That's how I look at it.
And I loved your comment you said about getting to know your main character by the end of the book. And I feel like for me, especially because she never leaves and we follow her through, she starts at 9 and ends in her 60s by the
Yeah.
time the book closes. Um, I felt like even when the time period would jump, either like significant jumps or wherever, I kind of could anticipate how she would react because I've gotten to know the character, which was fun for me as a reader because you're like, oh, I think I know how she,
Yeah.
yeah, it was fun. At least I greatly enjoyed. I know we have a ton of questions coming in and I want to make sure to get to
Uh-oh.
some of them. Um, I was gonna see here. We did have some people point out, and we do have some glassmaking shops around the area up by like Chagrin, and I know around Cleveland. And I went to one, and I was thinking of it while writing this book, just how the intense heat and all the insane safety precautions they made us take in having none.
Yes, I know. I know. And if you go on Murano now, they don't wear all that stuff. I mean, they would make you wear it if they were teaching you, but they don't wear the goggles and there's like glass all over the floor, glass fragments, and it's kind of wild. I love it. It's like a Wild West out there. I love it.
Dottie would like to know, uh, Ursula, our main character, is a bit of an enigma being a female in the glassmaking, even though
Mhm.
women did make beads at the time. Are there more women in the glass industry now, especially in Murano?
There are, but it's still primarily male, and it's quite rare to see a woman at the furnace. It's interesting. I got to know an American woman who lives on Murano, has been there 20 years, and her husband is a glass maestro, and he has a furnace and all that, and she works making glass beads and other stuff, and she was my gateway into this very closed society. And I got to know people and meet people and see people at work much more than I would have otherwise. So I'm incredibly grateful to her. But there are the women who are working in glass there by and large are making smaller stuff, are making jewelry and beads and stuff. But very occasionally you'd see I mean, it's not like they're forbidden the way they used to be, but they are not. And it's quite hard to be around a lot of men. It's sort of like firefighters. You might see the odd woman firefighter now, but just not that many. Or pilots. I mean, it's still surprising how few women are pilots. It's kind of like that. So you do see one, but it's like, oh, surprise. So yeah, there are, it's changing a little bit, but it's still primarily a male profession.
We there's a lot of good questions. Um, Someone wanted to know, oh, because of how I'm trying to sum it up because it's a good question, and I don't know if everyone's read the book, which again, I highly encourage you to. Um, did you map out the locations while you're writing? Because the book you use a lot, like especially when you're describing Venice, like it feels well traveled. You feel like it's grounded. Do you have to map that out while writing, or do you attempt those routes yourself? Because you said you visited Venice. Like, how do you plan that?
Yes. I got to know on Murano, I definitely mapped it out. And there are some locations that actually exist. And then like the Rosso's house and their workshop, I deliberately made it a little vague because I thought I don't want any of the glassmakers there to think that I'm basing it on theirs. And because they might get annoyed by that. So it's ever so slightly uncertain where they are. I kind of know where they are, but it's a little, but there are definitely walks that characters do. And in Venice, there's a scene where Orsola and one of her brothers is walking through Venice looking for the other brother. And that path that they took, I definitely walked myself a few times. I think I walked it and then I wrote it and then I walked it again to make sure I got it right and where the sun hits and what tower they would see and all of that. So I try to make that as accurate as possible.
I think that's one of the things I always enjoy about your books is even though I've never been to Venice, it feels when you're reading it, you feel the sense of the city and you can picture it in your head as you're going on. Um, we have a couple questions on writing, especially when dealing with time, from two different people. Melinda wrote she loves to hear you read your own work. Do you read aloud while you're writing or when you finish a draft before you send it out into the world?
I don't read the whole thing because that would just kill me. But I do read particularly passages where feels a little clunky to me. That's how I smooth out the sentences sometimes is it's only when you read it aloud that you realize what isn't working. So I definitely use that as a technique and I recommend it, though I don't think you necessarily need to read the whole thing. That would be hard. But yeah, for sure. That helps a lot.
And I know we've had people, the one thing, at least when it came to writing, because I will be honest, I do not speak any Italian. And the one time I went to Italy, I think I just used Spanish for the part where I was in Rome. 'Cause I did not speak Italian, but enough people spoke Spanish. Um, Fine, but I loved in the back of the book,
Oh,
especially I
yes.
found myself Googling to look up what lamp work was and all of that so I could get a better sense of the character. But I love the Italian Venetian glossary, especially to translate what some of the gondoliers were saying to
Oh,
each
I
other.
know. There's a lot of so there are two languages. There's Italian and Venetian, and I don't speak either of them, or just the tiniest bit. And Venetians are kind of Venetians and Italians understand each other's language, but they don't speak it, if that makes sense. So it's kind of a dialect. But I used there are a lot of Italian words throughout the book and the glossary has the definitions, but you can usually work it out from the context. None of it is that difficult. But there are three moments when characters use Venetian. It's for moments of heightened emotion. So it's either curses or blessings, or uh, oh gosh, what's the other thing? Anger. Yeah, so it's prayers and blessings and the swearing I really loved learning those and using them, and I got a Venetian historian to teach me some of them. And there was one that I learned, the gondoliers do swear a lot, and there was one that they use now that I can't possibly repeat in English because it's too vulgar, but somebody taught it to me. And when you're saying it in somebody else's language, it just doesn't have quite the same power. So I was merrily using it throughout the book, and the Venetian historian read it and went, "Oh, Tracy, you cannot use that. I will not let you. It's just too awful." Um, and especially you would never have a woman say it, and I don't even want anybody else to say it. So here's some alternatives. And I thought the alternatives were every bit as salty as what I had been using. So it's all about context swearing, really. We all swear in English, and somebody who's not an English speaker might use some of the words in the wrong times, or it's just like the tone isn't right. And so I had to get somebody to correct that for me.
I love the scenes with the gondoliers, especially with Domingo, who I then further
And it,
researched into, which
yes.
was a fascinating
Yeah,
side character and insight into the history of Venice.
I based him, Domenico is an African gondolier, and there were enslaved people in Venice. I had not realized this until I saw a 15th century painting by Carpaccio, which is this huge scene on the Grand Canal, and there are all these noblemen, or there's all these gondoliers in the water, and right front and center is an African gondolier, and I just had no idea. And I read about it and discovered that he would have been a slave, and he would have been enslaved. And so I just thought, I think I wanted him to be included because it seemed like such an insular society, and yet there were people from all over the place. So Ursula's main merchant who sells stuff for her is German, and there were all kinds of people from all over. And I think Domenico kind of represents that. And he plays a small but very important role about trying to find freedom, really. And in a way, that's what Ursula is trying to do with her work as well. So no, he's very important.
I think, yeah, there's obvious history like with Napoleon, the plague, flooding, world wars, Venice dealing, but I also there was history that you incorporated like with Domingo and slavery and the different merchants who are coming and living there that maybe doesn't get as much highlights or we're not as well known to.
Yeah.
I enjoyed. And I put the link in the chat too, if you wanted to see the portrait, because once I read that that was inspired, I had to immediately go look it up because why would you not? And then also to see what the Rosetta beads are, which are gorgeous that Maria first created. We do have a few more questions. Donna just wanted to state that she thought that the use of the skipping stone across the water helped her with the change in time, and she enjoyed the vision of it.
Thank you. Yeah, that was a late development. I thought I need a metaphor that's going to help people understand what I mean about the time. And so I used this metaphor of you're standing on the shore and you skim a stone and it touches down, and we are the stone that touches down in these different times. And so I hope that I'm glad to hear that helped you.
Especially revisiting it as the book goes on, it just feels it grounds it in a way. Um, we have a few more people wanting to know, which is obviously we knew this one was going to come up. What are you working on now, or do you have any exciting projects coming up in the future?
Yeah, I'm in the middle of writing a next novel, and this was such a long and complicated book to write, research and write, that I decided I wanted something that was going to be a little bit more contained. And so I'm writing a novel set in the north of England, and it's about a murder that actually took place in 1826 of an old man named Joe the Quilter, who I had heard about when I started quilting years ago. He was unusually, for that time, was a male quilter, and made his living that way. And he was brutally murdered in his cottage in his late 70s, and they never worked out who did it. And I'm not sure if I'm going to work out who did it, but I think I'm going to speculate. And also, it's about how that murder affects a really small, tight-knit community. And it's so different because the murder happened on January 3rd, 1826. So the whole book is set in the winter, and it's cold, and it's really, really dreary up there when it's that time of year. And it takes place over 2 months rather than 500 years. And it's in English. Oh, I don't have to do any research in other languages or get somebody to translate for me. So it's just not an easier subject, but it's an easier to write. So I'm about a little over halfway through that.
It sounds excellent, and I can't wait to read it. We have one final question, which we've gotten a few times. Some people have pointed to know, are you wearing Murano glass beads on your earrings?
Yeah. Yes, I am. Here we go. Yes. These are, I have a whole bunch from this one. These two, Sorelle is sister in Italian, and Sorella, and the Sorelle scent. These two sisters, their last name is Scent, and they make jewelry very simple but in beautiful colors. And every time I go, I like to get some. So and I thought, I think probably for the next several months, I'm just going to only be wearing glass because, because I have to be on brand, have to be with it. But luckily it's beautiful, beautiful stuff they wear. And I have other glass from other makers as well, which has been a lot of fun to collect.
Say. Well, I want to thank you so much, Tracy, for joining us today. It was just a privilege to be able to talk with you and to have you back, at least virtually this time, to discuss the Glassmaker. Which again, I put the link in the chat if you'd like to purchase a copy from our local independent bookstore, the Learned Owl. We also have copies here at the library for you to check out. And Tracy, thank you so much, and we'd love to have you back again sometime in the future.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure, and hopefully, yes, next time I'll see you all in person.
Thank you, everyone, and have a great rest of your morning. Bye.
Bye.